not get in trouble, not get fined, not have your certificate suspended or revoked, you're going to have to know the regulations. This video here is going to try to clear up some of the more confusing ones and hit the highlights of the ones that you definitely have to know. This video is not replacing any of the private pilot knowledge you're expected to know before you come here. It will brush over some of them, but we're not going to go through regulation by regulation on not drinking and flying and reporting your address change within 30 days and all the other stuff that hopefully you haven't quite forgotten yet from private pilot ground school. We're going to talk about all the new stuff. The overview today, we're going to talk about part 6. So we're going to go back and forth between a lot of these regulations. It's a lot of legal speak, and so many sections and so many regulations apply to or refer to other regulations and sections. So we're going to dance around a little bit, and we'll try to keep it kind of back on track. So part 1, if you're looking into Title 14, the Code of Federal Regulations, we'll kind of see the lay of the land here in a second. Talks about definitions and abbreviations. Part 61 is certification. Okay, that's how you get your license. Part 91, these are all the different rules and regulations under Part 91, general operating rules and regulations. That's how you lose your license. And we'll talk about a whole bunch of others. We'll spend a lot of time talking about Part 119, which is certification of air carriers and commercial operators, as in what you have to do to become certified as an air carrier, or what you have to do to get an operating certificate to be a commercial operator, and what you can do as a commercial pilot without going through all those extra hoops. And then, of course, NTSB 830. It's actually a whole different title of the regulations, and we'll get more into that. But that's what you have to report and why you have to report it, basically, if something goes wrong. All the references are going to be from the Commercial Pilot Test Prep. That's chapter 4, I think, of the Commercial Pilot Test Prep book, and there's going to be a whole bunch of questions and answers and great introductory paragraphs in each one of the regulations. However, we're going to use links here to the FAR-AIM if you have it, and to the Electronic Code of Federal Regulations. That gives you the updated regulations, and that's where we refer to a lot of in this video. And then, of course, I like to go to Bold Method. They have got great articles on operating Part 91 versus 135, private versus common carriage. So if you still have any questions after this video, then go ahead and point towards Bold Method there and see what they have to help you out with. So let's start with that commercial pilot certificate, which is why you're here in commercial pilot ground school. So to become a commercial pilot, okay, not an airline pilot, that's something different, right? So to become a commercial pilot, you have to be at least 18. You have to receive the required ground training, which is of course what this video is part of in the ground school here. So Part 141 requires a minimum number of ground training. Part 61 doesn't, but you still have to know all the same stuff, basically. And then flight training, we'll get more into specifics on flight training and aeronautical experience, but then watching this video is not enough for a commercial certificate. You have to go out and actually take a flight lesson and learn how to do all the stuff. Aeronautical experience is how many hours you have to gain and what those hours have to contain, and we'll talk about that more next. The Airman Knowledge Test, you'll get specific instructions on how to take that test at the end of our course here. Your last module in our course is going to have you apply for a certificate, and when you get that certificate in the mail, it's going to have all the testing procedures and instructions there for you. And then, of course, after you've done all this other stuff, you go past the check ride. That's the oral and practical exam. When you sit down and you go through all the logbooks and your logbooks and aircraft logbooks and question and answer periods, and it's your time to really shine and show off and show an examiner just how much you know about the subject and how well you fly an aircraft doing the maneuvers. But let's see, okay, so aeronautical knowledge. This is everything you have to learn about, theoretically, everything you have to learn about to become a commercial pilot. So this is in 14 CFR, which is Title 14, the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 61.125. Says to become a commercial pilot, this is all the stuff you have to know about. So far in this course, if you're watching the regulations now, we're covering NTSB today. We've already covered aerodynamics, principles of flight. Meteorology is covered in depth in our weather course, and it was touched on in Private Pilot. We'll talk about it a little bit in this class too. And then safe and efficient operation. Well, we don't actually operate aircraft for this online course, but we actually will do weight and balance calculations, performance charts, we're going to learn basically everything else on here. We've already touched on charts again. Okay, so why do we cover so much stuff in our courses here? Because we have to. That's why, because they're listed in the regulations. A little more in the weeds on aeronautical experience. So specifically, all this just requires to airplane single engine land. Okay, there's actually different maneuvers and different regulations and different numbers for multi-engine or for rotorcraft or for gliders or for balloons. Okay, so to become an airplane single engine land commercial pilot, before you can take your check ride, you have to have at least 250 hours of total pilot time. Yeah, that could include helicopters, airplanes, anything that you've logged in your logbook of pilot time. You need 250 total. Of that 250, 100 hours needs to be in a powered aircraft. So let's say you're a glider pilot. You got 1,000 hours of glider time. Well, only 150 hours would count towards your commercial. You still need 100 hours in a powered aircraft. Of that, you at least have to have 50 in airplanes. So let's say you could have 50 hours of helicopter time and 50 hours of airplane time. You still have the minimums met on the total time requirements to become a commercial pilot. Of those 250 hours, you have to have at least 100 PIC. Now, as pilot in command, we'll get more into that in a second. And to become an airplane pilot, you have to have at least 50 hours of pilot in command in airplanes, and you actually have to have 50 hours of cross-country pilot in command total time. So you could have 50 hours of cross-country pilot in command helicopters, and it would count towards airplanes. You have to have 10 hours of cross-country, specifically pilot command time in airplanes. So the way these regulations are written, they're kind of confusing. It's so you can use existing experience. You can use multi-engine time to get your single engine or vice versa. I personally did helicopter time first and then transitioned into airplanes, so I get to use a lot of my helicopter time towards my commercial certificates. And because it's a whole different process, then you're adding on a category or a class instead of a whole new commercial certificate. So actually, a lot of these things don't apply to you when you add on a category and a class anyway. But anyway, you have to have 20 hours of dual time of 61.127B1. That's specifically this regulation, if you look it up, says of the maneuvers that you have to do in a airplane for commercial training. So all the stuff you did for private pilot was under a different regulation. So you had 20 hours of dual to become a private pilot, but that was under a different set of maneuvers that you were doing. So you have to have 20 more hours as a commercial pilot of dual training for your commercial certificate. Of that, it has to have at least 10 hours of instrument training, which if you have your instrument instrument rating, like most pilots will, not all, but most pilots, then you've probably already got your 10 hours of instrument training. But as we'll see in a second, you don't actually have to have your instrument first before you become a commercial pilot. In those instances, you have to have at least 10 hours of instrument training before your commercial check ride. And then for airplane single engine land, okay, this doesn't count for helicopters, but you need 10 hours of complex turbine or the most recent addition to this regulation, 10 hours in a TAA aircraft, a technologically advanced avionics aircraft. That's in bold because we'll talk about that in the next slide. Of your 250 hours of total time, you have to have 10 hours of solo, and those 10 hours of solo have to include one cross country or your solo more than 300 nautical miles total distance. It's 250 straight line distance, so you have to go at least 250 miles from point A to point B if it's as the crow flies. And then 5 hours of night VFR. There's a whole other bunch of stipulations, and your flight instructor will get into the weeds with you on this one and make sure you have for instance, the dual cross countries that are completed and all the other minute stuff that's in there. Really what I want to talk about here was of your 20 hours of dual instruction, it has to be for your commercial. You can't use the stuff you did for private. And then you have to have 10 hours in a complex. And up until recently, you had to do when I'm filming this video anyway, you had to do your commercial check ride in a complex airplane. And that's no longer the case. You just have to have your 10 hours of complex time, and then you could do your check ride in a non-complex, or let's say a 172 or a fixed gear, pretty simple aircraft. More recently, you don't even need 10 hours of complex time. You can do 10 hours of technical TAA aircraft time. Now, the same regulation does a pretty good job of defining a technically advanced airplane. Okay, so they basically say overall a technically advanced aircraft will have a PFD and an MFD, and this regulation goes on to further explain what qualifies as a PFD and an MFD, and a two-axis autopilot. So at least a pitch and a roll is usually the first two axes that autopilots help control. Now, and then the fourth element there is the PFD and the MFD have to be their own unique components. They can't be one screen that you switch back and forth between the two. So it's really a whole lot cheaper and actually safer to upgrade an aircraft to a technically advanced aircraft as long as you know how to use it. Anyway, so you can use your fixed gear glass panel, old 172N model time if it has a PFD and MFD and an autopilot. Now it's a TAA aircraft, and you don't ever have to fly a complex ever. Okay, so they do a good job defining TAA in that same regulation. While we talked about this, you can get a commercial certificate if you don't have an instrument rating. However, if you don't have an instrument rating on your commercial certificate, you will actually have this limitation on your certificate, where the carriage of passengers for hire and what different categories or classes of aircraft on cross-country flights in excess of 50 nautical miles or at night is prohibited. So let's say you do get your commercial, but you didn't really want to go for your instrument training yet. You can still fly as a commercial pilot. You can do things like crop dusting, banner towing, photography, most helicopter work. Most of that stuff you need to be a commercial pilot, but you don't have to have your instrument rating for it. So you're just limited. You can fly aircraft over 50 nautical miles. You just can't carry people for hire more than 50 nautical miles or at night. So before you're going to go very far with people or before you're going to fly at night with people, you need an instrument rating. So you're kind of limited to what you can do until you get that instrument rating. Some other reasons, a lot of times the insurance will go down once you get the instrument rating because you have more training and you're more capable and you're more prepared if things go wrong. And then of course you'll be a better pilot, so why not do that? All right, so let's kind of get into, let's have a scenario here. Congratulations, you just passed your commercial check ride. Pretty much words just like this will happen on your check ride. And then here's the scenario they give you. All right, so your best friend, you post it on Facebook, you pass your check ride, and you start getting messages from people. Hey, that's great, you're a commercial pilot now, so can I get a buddy pass for your airline? And they don't realize that you're a commercial pilot. You're not an airline pilot because they're two different things. But then they say, hey, listen, I just bought an RV up in Temecula, but I need to drive the RV back down here to San Diego. But how do I get my car up there and the RV back down here? And you tell them, well, you can always tow it, but then they have to rent the dolly to tow the car anyway. So they say, well, how about you just fly me up there and drop me off at the airport? Oh, that's cool. You're looking for reasons to build up your cross-country PIC time anyway for your ATP certificate coming up someday. And then he says, hey, I'll pay you $100. Can you take that? So it sounds good. You're a commercial pilot, which means you can fly for compensation or for hire. And so they're offering to pay you money to go one place to another. And it's pretty tempting. However, the answer is going to be no. You can't do that. If you take that money from your friend, you'd be operating an illegal charter. You would have flown somebody from point A to point B for hire, and which means they're paying you to do it or for compensation, and you can't do that. So remember, just because you're a commercial pilot doesn't mean you can fly for hire on demand. So there's actually a whole new regulation. Part 135 applies to on-demand operations. In other words, charters, where people say, hey, I want you to take me to here, and you can do that. So there's a lot more paperwork and training and regulations and stuff that applies to you when you start flying people and stuff around. Okay, so basically, as a commercial pilot, you can now get paid to fly, but there's so many red tapes and so much red tape you have to go through first for so many of the operations. So let's get into this then. What can you do then as a commercial pilot? Well, you may act as pilot in command of an aircraft, that's PIC, carrying persons or property for hire. That's great. Okay, examples of that, like take somebody from point A to point B, San Diego to Temecula, give people tours, do photo flights, all that cool stuff. You can fly around for hire. You can carry persons or property. Provided, okay, so this means there's going to be a whole lot of limitations there. Or you can fly for compensation or hire. So carrying people or flying for hire. And the example there, towing banners, ferrying aircraft, or spraying crops. You're not flying people around. You're not necessarily flying cargo around. You're flying the aircraft, and that is what you're doing. Okay, provided. So first, where do we go from here? Let's start with this. What does it mean to fly for compensation or for hire? For hire is easy. That means for money. People pay you money to do something. That's for hire. A little more confusing, however, or open for interpretation for some, would be compensation. So to fly for compensation, it doesn't mean you're making money from it. It doesn't mean you're going to get promised money from it. It doesn't even mean that money is involved in it at all. So compensation, according to the FAA, or at least according to the uh, lawyers in the FAA, the Office of the Chief Counsel, is compensation is the receipt of anything of value. And they give specific examples of, in the past, they found that reimbursement of expenses. So let's say if somebody else pays for the fuel and you don't pay for the fuel, even if they pay for the oil or maybe a flight back from your destination, if they pay for food or drink or pay for your hotel room, those are all flying for compensation. A little harder to wrap your head around because it kind of depends on each example, but let's say gaining flight time on its own is actually flying for hire. And that's probably a question that comes up in private pilot as they say, hey, you got 50 hours now, you got your private, how are you going to build your time for commercial? You say, well, I'm going to post on the internet, and if people need to go places, I'll offer to split the time with them. You're kind of splitting hairs there because you're actually looking for more flight time. And that is the purpose of you splitting costs with people, and you can get in trouble if you start doing that. Uh, just to close that loophole, then basically it comes down to what was the purpose of the flight. If the purpose of the flight was you to get cheap flight time, that's accumulating flight time for compensation. You're not paying for the whole portion of that flight. So. But anyway, goodwill in the form of expected future economic benefit. And so, in other words, if I do this flight for you, will you hire me in the future? That's compensation because you're going to get something in the future for it. So careful you don't get yourself into trouble before you even have your commercial certificate by trying to skirt the system. Yes, it takes a lot of money to get 250 hours, but it's going to be worth it in the end. Okay, so let's get back to this then. So you may act as private in command of an aircraft carrying persons or property for hire or for compensation or for hire. Now, the provided that we talked about was provided you are qualified in accordance with this part, which is part 61, you're a commercial pilot, and with the applicable parts of this chapter. So now you need to start looking into uh, other uh, other regulations that say, and this is a little vague. And this is how they do it. Okay, so we need as long as we're a commercial pilot and we're commercial pilot certificated according to Part 61. Okay, great. Now we have to also comply with all the other rules and all the other parts that apply in this entire FAR-AIM book. So that gets a little confusing. So to answer that, we're going to kind of look at the other parts they're talking about. So we already talked about part 1, definitions, abbreviations, and trust me, we'll get back into that in a second. So far, we've been talking about part 61, how to get your license. Okay, part 91, again, how you lose it. Part 119 applies to air carriers and commercial operators. For reference here, part 121 talks about domestic flag and supplemental operations. So like your scheduled air carriers, your airlines, and your scheduled cargo haulers. Part 135 is on demand, so you're just hanging out, waiting for people to show up and where they need to go places. Think of it as air taxis. 136, for instance, talks about commercial air tours and national parks. And then, for instance, part 137 talks about agricultural aircraft. If you're going to go crop dust, you have to follow the regulations in part 137. Okay, so just a quick glance through here. Just because you're a commercial pilot means that you can operate under Part 121 if you follow all those extra rules. You can operate under Part 135 if you follow all their extra rules. You can do tours if you follow all the extra requirements of Part 136. You can be a crop duster, comma, pause for effect, if you comply with all the regulations of Part 137. So really, we're going to drop down a rabbit hole here on part 119, or all these regulations, basically. Since we don't really know what air carrier or all these other terms mean, let's just go straight to 1.1, which is definitions and abbreviations, and let's start there. So, of course, if you search for 14 ECFR, which brings you to the Electronic Code of Federal Regulations, the ones that are updated regularly from the government, gives you the most up-to-date definitions, abbreviations, and regulations. So while I'm not going to go through the entire index of regulations, I'm just going to hit some highlights, and you can, of course, go look them up yourself if you want some more information on them. So specifically, just said Part 119 is air carrier and commercial operator. So an air carrier is any person who undertakes directly by lease or other arrangement to engage in air transportation. Okay, so we need to define air transportation, which is interstate, overseas, or foreign air transportation, or the transportation of mail by aircraft. Okay, let's see. So, in other words, air transportation is used in the definition for air transportation. Okay, if you're an air carrier, it means you're flying stuff, and by flying stuff, that means air transportation. And some of these, I get rid of some of the extra legal words on there. So, air commerce basically means if you're in any federal airway or airspace and you're navigating an aircraft, you're operating in air commerce, which means if you're flying anything, anywhere, doing anything, it's going to be air commerce, except for the private pilot regulations, which you should know coming into this course. Okay, they specifically talked about a commercial operator, and that sounds like something we need to know. It's a person who, for compensation or hire, we just learned about that, engages in the carriage by aircraft in air commerce, which we just learned about that, if you carry persons or property other than as an air carrier or foreign air carrier under authority of Part 375. We just saw that domestic and flag operations are 121s. If it's doubtful that operation is for compensation or for hire, okay, if you say I'm not making any compensation or any money off of this, or I'm not getting paid for this, there's a test for that. Okay, so the test applied is whether the carriage by air is merely incidental to the person's other business or is in itself a major enterprise for profit. So as we continue down the rabbit hole, we need to learn what incidental to business or major enterprise for profit is. So here's some examples then. Incidental to business. In my words, I like to say you were going to do it anyway. So that's incidental to business. So for example, if you're going to fly somewhere for a meeting, yeah, you can fly instead, and that's actually okay. Because you were going to go there anyway. It saves you a little bit of time on the road, maybe. Besides, you're a pilot and you need to fly anyway to stay current, and flying is a much better way to travel. So let's say you can't make the company any more money whether you drive or fly. And honestly, it's the same whether you have a pilot certificate or not. However, a major enterprise for profit. Think of it this way: the boss says, "Oh, sure, you can fly to this meeting, but you got to take some coworkers so we can make more business. Hey, how about you take some examples and some flyers up there with you and give them to our customers since we have all this extra room in the airplane." When you start making money off of it, that's in furtherance of a business or making a profit. Okay, so you have to be really careful that you're not trying to use air transportation and air commerce to make your business more money, because you start getting into other regulations and other gray areas there. Okay, so as we continue down the rabbit hole for definitions, some other examples of stuff you're going to find here in 1.1. Honestly, just looking up the basic definition of some of these terms will win you an argument or two at the flight school. So a crew member is any person assigned to perform duty in an aircraft. Okay, so I put out this up here because if there's two of you in the aircraft, and one of you is instructing and the other one is a student, you're both required crew members, because you can't do that flight. Let's leave that there, because you can't do that flight without an instructor and without a student. Just like a lot of larger aircraft require flight attendants, they are required crew members because of the number of passengers that are on board. And they actually flight crew members is what I was getting into there. So now let's see. Flight time and this is important because this is what you put in your logbook to get all those hours to become a commercial pilot. It's pilot time that commences when an aircraft moves under its own power for the purpose of flight and ends when the aircraft comes to rest after landing. So in other words, when you first start the engine and it lurches around a little bit, that's when the clock starts ticking. After you land, let's say it takes you 10 minutes to taxi from the runway back to a full stop. You count that as flight time too, because it was part of the flight. So flight time is not just the time the wheels were in the air. Flight time is the entire time you move that aircraft with the intention of flight. Now, however, if I light up the aircraft and I want to taxi to the fuel pump to get gas, then I shut down when I get over to the fuel pump to get gas, that wasn't flight time because I never intended on flying. And also, you see, with the purpose of flight, okay, so you might actually be able to say that, well, I taxied to the run up area because I was going to go fly, but then the magneto check failed on me and I had to taxi back and shut down. According to this regulation, that was flight time because you moved for the purpose of flight. Um, so just add to your arguments there next time that happens to you. I personally don't want to log flight time if I actually flew. Okay, let's keep down these bunny holes. Okay, they talk about a large aircraft that's more than 12,500 pounds. And that's one of the requirements to have a type rating is you must have a type rating for a large aircraft, and that's what a large aircraft is. That's also where they define night. Okay, so they define night as the time between the end of evening civil twilight and the beginning of morning civil twilight, as it is converted to local time. So not sunset. Okay, so I basically talk about three different things that happen every night, and basically, sun hits the horizon, that's sunset. Your position lights come on. About 25 minutes later, here in San Diego, most of the year, you start logging nighttime, but you would actually have to look up the air almanac and see when the end of evening civil twilight is. It just happens to be around 25 minutes after sunset. In the northern parts of the U.S., and especially during the winter months, it might be an hour after sunset, depending on how long the sunset takes. And then an hour after sunset is when your passenger currency requirements start. Okay, so every night, sun hits the horizon, sunset, position lights come on. 25 minutes later or so, you start logging nighttime. An hour after sunset, you needed to be current to carry passengers, and you can get current to carry passengers again. All right, continue on with our rabbit hole here and some definitions. So to operate an aircraft. Okay, so this is important because you as the pilot are operating it because you caused it to be used. But the person who told you to go fly is also operating the aircraft because they allowed it to be used. They said, here, take this aircraft and go do that. Um, so when you're operating an aircraft, it has to do with the legal control of the aircraft or not. Anybody involved in that aircraft flying was operating the aircraft. And then when they talk about operational control, that's whoever started the initiating or the conducting or the terminating of the flight. So we'd like to think that the captain of the aircraft, or you maybe as a sole occupant, are in full operational control of the aircraft because it doesn't fly without you, and you say when it lands. Okay, also in 1.1, it's where they talk about categories and classes of aircraft and airmen. And it's something that's often confused that I see in my experience. So, the category of airmen is going to be like airplane, rotorcraft, glider. Okay, let's go to class of airmen is going to be single engine, multi-engine, land, water. Okay, let's go back to category of aircraft. It's a little different, all right? So category of aircraft starts with normal, utility, acrobatic, or restricted, and then a class would be airplane, rotorcraft, glider. Okay, so category of airmen would be like an airplane single engine, or sorry, category airman. So an airman, when we're talking about airmen here, so it'd be a airplane category, single engine class. That's for the airmen. We talk about the aircraft itself, it's a normal category airplane class. Okay, so fortunately, your pilot certificate is what the airmen categories and classes are, but the aircraft themselves that you have normal and utility categories of aircraft are slightly different. Okay, really important one here, pilot in command. Pilot in command is the person who has final authority and responsibility for the operation and safety of the flight. Okay, nobody can tell you to fly an aircraft because in the end it is up to you. You're the pilot in command. And you have been designated before or during the flight. So let's say halfway through the flight, you and your friend are flying and they say, hey, I don't feel well. Can you take over as pilot in command? You can still do it, all right? It doesn't have to only be before. But you can only be a PIC if you hold the appropriate category, class, and type rating, if appropriate for the conduct. What they mean by that is I can't fly, I'm not a glider rated pilot, so I cannot log pilot in command in a glider until I take my check ride and become a glider pilot. The only exception is when you are solo training for that certificate. When you solo an aircraft, somebody has to be pilot in command, so kind of by default, it's you. And this is also why you start logging PIC the day of your private pilot check ride, and hopefully you log PIC thereafter when you're with an instructor in a single engine, for instance. If you take your private pilot single engine check ride, then you should be logging private pilot single engine PIC time in a single engine thereafter. Now, this is a big argument that we get into a lot, so let's continue our rabbit hole dive here. On 6151, we talk about pilot logbooks. Okay, so there's basically two different things of PIC. You can either act as PIC. That means, obviously, you're in charge. The aircraft, if anything goes wrong, you're going to be the one to blame for something going wrong. That is acting as PIC. Or you can log PIC. That means you put it in the column in your logbook as PIC. Now, most of the time, more than one person can log PIC, especially if you're with an instructor. There's very few times where you both would not log PIC. Because when you're logging PIC, you're either alone in the aircraft, you're acting as PIC and you're logging PIC, or the sole manipulator of the controls in an airplane you're rated to fly. So if you have that category and class on your airman certificate, you get to log PIC if you're the one manipulating the flight controls. There's different regulations for larger jet aircraft, okay, things that require type ratings, but when we're talking about, let's say you get your 172 private pilot certificate, and now you're going on to fly a tailwheel or a complex, even under training, you can log PIC time, because you're the sole manipulator of the controls of an aircraft of which you are rated. You don't have to wait until you get your tailwheel endorsement to log tailwheel PIC, because you already have your private pilot airplane single engine land. You're already rated in that aircraft. You get to log PIC while you're flying it. This is often and very unfortunately very commonly misconstrued and mislogged. I see it probably just as many times in logbooks as I see it logged correctly, especially when it comes down to complex here. So again, to log PIC time in your logbook, you don't have to have that high performance or that tailwheel endorsement. Okay, the flight instructor you're flying with that does have that tailwheel or that complex or that high performance endorsement, they are the ones acting as PIC because they have the endorsement to do so. Meanwhile, while you're learning how to fly them, working on getting your endorsement yourself, you get to log PIC while doing that. Okay, so if you have any questions on that, if you're a flight instructor who wants to argue about it, you can go ahead and search for the 2009 legal interpretation from Jason Herman. Basically, what the legal interpretations are is Mr. Herman here emailed the FAA a question specifically about this, and they researched it, and then they got back to him in this letter here. And this says they wanted to know if they could log PIC time when they were in a complex or a high-performance aircraft. And in his question here, he says, you don't have the endorsement yet, but you were the sole manipulator of the controls. They want to know if they can log PIC. And let me skip down here to the end to where they talk about there's a big distinction between logging PIC and acting as PIC. And in the end, they say, in your example, the pilot may log PIC if that pilot is properly rated, even though that pilot does not have the required endorsements to act as PIC. So if you are one of those many student pilots or aspiring commercial pilots who have 10 or so hours of complex time in your logbook that you did not log as PIC, it was more than likely logged incorrectly, and it should have been logged as PIC. And if your flight instructor argues with you about that, tell them to go argue with the FAA about that, because that's what the FAA said. And also, if you ever email the FAA with a question, they're probably going to put your home address out there for everybody else to see for eternity. Okay. So that's a really important logbook regulation there that I wanted to make sure you know. I've seen way too many pilots log high performance, tailwheel, and complex incorrectly in their logbooks. Now, however, doesn't mean you could just willy-nilly log PIC for everything. Okay, if you have an airplane single engine certificate, you cannot log PIC in a multi-engine airplane until you take your multi-engine check ride. So, for instance, it's just like when you were a student pilot. Now, you're a student pilot, you're not logging PIC with your instructor. The day you take your private pilot check ride, now you can log PIC with your instructor because you're rated in the aircraft. You're not rated in a multi. So you go on to get your multi-engine certificate. You start flying multi-engine aircraft. You don't not get to log PIC because you're not rated in a multi-engine airplane yet. If you're lucky enough to go solo the multi, you could, but that's not required for an add-on rating, and generally you won't see people let you take their twin-engine airplane out by yourself anyway. So you'd have to hurry up and get your multi-engine check ride before you start logging PIC in the multi-engine airplane. All right, we're back on track now. So we're back out of the rabbit hole. Let's see what we can do as a new commercial pilot. We talked about what you can't do, so let's talk about what we can do. So we look into part 119 here. This is certification for air carriers and commercial operators. And we just learned the definitions of both those terms there. So this says that 119.1, or these rules and regulations, apply to each person operating or intending to operate civil aircraft. Huh, that's a new term. So back down the rabbit hole we go. A civil aircraft is aircraft other than a public aircraft. That's awesome. So I guess we get to look up public aircraft now. Public aircraft, any of the following there's a whole bunch more. This goes on and on forever. I'm going to break it down for you pretty easy. If it's a government or a military aircraft, or it's chartered to fly for the military, it's a public aircraft. So none of these rules apply to law enforcement. They don't apply to military. They don't actually apply to a civilian aircraft. It was contracted to fly for the military. Think like when you see the airlines that are flying planefuls of Marines and sailors and soldiers back and forth to conflict areas and back again. Even though it was a civilian aircraft yesterday and it's a civil aircraft tomorrow, today it's flying for the government. So today it's a public aircraft. So your two broad categories there. So if you're a military aircraft, if you're a military pilot, you obviously get paid to fly for a living. Most of them do not have their commercial certificate. They're just a private pilot, but they get paid to fly for a living. That's because they're flying public aircraft. So just if you're a military pilot doesn't mean you can fly the airlines without getting any other endorsements and ratings, because that's a civil aircraft. Same with law enforcement. Let's say if your local law enforcement or your federal law enforcement agencies, the pilots in those aircraft might just be a private pilot, and they can get paid to fly because they're flying public aircraft, and whole other sets of rules apply to them. So back to this civil aircraft. So if you're flying a civil aircraft, meaning you're not flying a government aircraft or for the government, these rules apply to you. So if you're flying a civil aircraft, if you are an air carrier or commercial operator or both in air commerce, sounds like that might be everything we just talked about there. So if you're making money, if you intend to make money, if you're trying to make money. And then they talk about, oh, look, another new term, when common carriage is not involved. So if you're in an aircraft with 20 seats or more, or maximum payload capacity of 6,000 pounds or more, okay, that's not the weight of the aircraft itself, it's the amount of payload you can put into it. Okay, so we have a new term, common carriage. Back into the rabbit hole. Okay, so common carriage, this term is discussed in depth and defined in Advisory Circular 120-12A. This is advisory circulars or things the FAA releases because they feel like they need to give you more information. The rule itself wasn't good enough. Also, if you look through the regulations, you won't see holding out or common carriage or private carriage defined. So they had to release this advisory circular giving you more information about this. So AC 120-12A is actually a pretty important document when you're going to become a commercial pilot. This talks about what common carriage is and what you can or can't do, and it defines actually some of these terms you can't find anywhere else. So you become a common carrier when you hold yourself out to the public or a segment of the public or anybody besides you, basically, and you are willing to provide transportation
And they say specifically that signs and advertising are the most direct means of holding out, but not the only ones. So let's say if you post a sign that says "We'll fly for food," that's technically holding out because you're looking to advertise your piloting services for something, for compensation. In this example, it would be food. Okay, but it's not just that. If the word of mouth stuff, if you write stuff on the whiteboard, if you put on your Facebook pilot, commercial pilot who's ready to start paying money, that's all different forms of holding out. So holding out it's when you make you're offering your services basically. So they give you physically holding out when you're advertising physically, and you have this reputation of offering to carry people, any people, not just hey, you're my best friend, sure, let's go flying today. But once your best friend says, hey, you should go fly with this person because it was a fun flight, they come to you looking for a flight as well too. Then word's starting to get around. And if you start taking all these customers, even if you didn't advertise to them, even if you didn't post anything anywhere, or even word of mouth, if people start coming to you with this work and you just take everybody who comes to you, they figured that's sufficient. That's still holding out. Even though you didn't advertise at all, you have a reputation for not turning people down. That's holding out. And then they also say that the fact that a holding out generates little successes of no consequence. Um, so literally, this comes down to you post on social media that, hey, I'm a commercial pilot. I'm looking forward to flying you places, or hit me up if you want to go to Vegas or something like that. Whether anybody takes you up on that offer or not, you were still holding out. So careful. Okay. Then they go on to define common carriage. Okay, so for you to be a common carrier, in other words, you hold out, right? Well, this is how they determine if you're a common carrier or not. So there's four elements to it. The four-part litmus test of becoming a common carrier. If you held out, that's step one, or you have a willingness to provide transport to persons or property. Okay, it's doesn't have to be one or the other, persons or property, from one place to another for compensation. So run this backwards. If you're willing to be paid to fly somebody from one place to another, then you are a common carrier. And then, of course, AC 120-12A, you can drop that into your search box, or you can go look it up yourself and learn a little bit more in the weeds about that regulation. Okay, so that's if you do that, you're a common carrier, and you're expected to follow a lot more training, regulations, inspections, and regulatory oversight requirements. So if you're a common carrier, you have a lot more on the line, and you've probably put a whole lot more money into it. Now, the opposite of common carriage would be private carriage, right? Okay, so then you'll see uncommon carriage or carriage other than common carriage and all the other legal ways of saying private carriage. So this is you're flying for hire, but you're not holding out. So private carriage, you have a core group of friends, and you fly them to bachelor parties, and you go to Vegas a whole bunch and stuff like that. That's private carriage. You didn't advertise. You turn people down if they hear from a friend who heard it from a friend and they come to you for it. It's generally for one or several selected customers. Generally long-term basis. Like it's literally it's a few people that know you are a commercial pilot and can fly them place to place. That's that's private carriage. They don't talk about the number of them, but if they don't give a specific number, they don't say 3 contracts, they don't say 5 contracts. But if someday the FAA comes to investigate and they say, I don't know, you flew 7 different people last year, I think that's probably too many, then you were common carriage in their eyes. So you need to be really careful not to overdo private carriage here. And you'll see here that they found common carriage where they just had 3 people. So because it might have been 3 completely unrelated customers, or it might have been on kind of a on-call basis, then they were determined with only 3 contracts that they were, um, well, okay, 4. They found private carriage were up to 3 people. So they don't limit it, but basically they say that they have in the past determined that up to 3 contracts have been approved as private carriage, but anything more than that, they don't have any proof saying that any more than that has been private carriage. So you might think, well, private carriage is the way to go then. I don't have to do all this paperwork and stuff, right? I'm not the term common carriage. Well, here's the problem. You still need what's called an operating certificate to operate private carriage, and this is where a lot of people get confused on this too. So we're back into 119 here, air carrier and commercial operators, right? So we're talking about private carriage in the chapter that talks about commercial operators here. You're still a commercial operator, you're just not flying common carriage. Okay, so let's look at a couple regulations. So if you're flying in uncommon, in other words, private carriage, under Part 125, which means you have 20 or more seats, or Part 135, which means you're on demand or you're a charter operation, you shall be issued one certificate authorizing such carriage. That one certificate, what we mean, is called an operating certificate, and it will either be for private carriage or for common carriage. You go a few paragraphs down in the same section, and they say if you hold an operating certificate, and this is cut and paste straight out of the regulations, authorizing private carriage, you shall not conduct common carriage. If a person holding an air carrier certificate or operating certificate authorizing common carriage shall not conduct private carriage. So right here it says that you need an operating certificate to operate private carriage because you can't do common carriage if you do. It also says that if you have a certificate authorizing common carriage, you cannot do private carriage. And remember, the big difference between those two is how many people you fly or if you hold out and advertise. So let's say if you start small and you have 1, 2, maybe 3 contacts and you fly them for private carriage, you cannot just say, well, this is great, I'm going to do it full time and start taking on 10 or 20 clients, because that would be common carriage. You need a new certificate for that. And finally, if you need a visual example of, okay, I'll get to that next. Here, let's do a visual example of it. Here's an operating certificate for common carriage operation and a different piece of paper operating certificate for private carriage operations. This is the example off of the FAA's FSIMs, basically their process they use to certify you as a commercial operator. You would get an operating certificate. So yes, whether you're common carriage or your private carriage, you will still get an operating certificate for either one of those operations. Okay, so let's get back to here and say another 119 regulations. If you're flying in private carriage, okay, so operators engaged in passenger carrying operations when common carriage is not involved. In other words, private carriage or non-common carriage. So if you're flying in something less than 20 seats, okay, so the 125 talked about 20 or more seats, so we're flying less than that, so 119.23 applies to us. I say if you're going to fly with less than 20 seats, but you're flying for private carriage, you have to comply with the certification of an operation specified requirement subpart C. So you have to have a commercial certificate and you have to have an air carrier certificate. And you either need to do part 135, which is be certified as a charter, except for only those commuter operations. That's your 121 stuff. And then basically, here's what I put down here for you. Be issued operational specifications, or op specs is what we call them, in accordance with those requirements. So once again, along with this operating certificate, you're probably going to have a whole encyclopedia, not really, but a whole thick binder of op specs that you have to follow for that specific operation. It'll say like drug testing programs, maintenance programs. It'll say which specific aircraft can fly on that operating certificate, which pilots can do it, extra stuff like whether it approves iPads or not, like whether you can do IFR with cargo, passengers, or both, or if you're VFR only, or if it requires 2 pilots for IFR. It would have all these additional restrictions on there, on top of the Part 121, 135, 119, and Part 91 regulations. It might have a whole additional set of rules, basically. So in other words, no, just because you took your commercial check ride a day doesn't mean you can go start flying on-demand operations, because you have a whole lot more you got to jump through first to do that. And see, there we go. Private carriage is part of one of the options on an operating certificate. All right, we're back on track again. We're back out of the rabbit hole. Let's get back to what we can or cannot do as a commercial pilot now, or another way of saying this is permissible business flying, things that you can do. Okay, So this applies to each person operating or intending to operate civil aircraft. We already talked about that. An air carrier, commercial operator, or both. Okay, so private or common carriage makes you a commercial operator. They say if it's private carriage only, if you have 20 or more passengers, okay, well, you're a brand new commercial pilot. You're probably not flying big O jets yet. So we can scroll down. You know what? Let's scroll way down. Let's go all the way down to that E paragraph on this. And let's make it bigger so we can see it. Except for operations when common carriage is not involved. So, except when you're doing private carriage. If you have 20, having a passenger seat of 20 seats or more. So, in other words, when you are flying an aircraft with 19 or fewer seats, this part does not apply to you. Let's look at that again. This part does not apply to you if you're flying 19 or fewer seats, unless you're flying common carriage. Okay, so back to this. You're flying private carriage. This doesn't apply to you if you're 19 or fewer seats. Here's what you can do. Look up this regulation. There's a whole long list, and I kind of rearranged them to make it easier to talk about. So 119E 1 through 11 tells you what you can do as a new commercial pilot. In other words, all the other stipulations and additional requirements of Part 119 do not apply to these things. Okay, this part does not apply to the following operations. However, I put asterisks on here because there's a lot more stipulations for these specific ones. All right, this regulation says you can do student instruction, but you only can do that if you have a CFI certificate. They put that on there because a prerequisite for becoming a CFI is to become a commercial, to hold a commercial certificate first. You can do nonstop commercial air tours, but you have to have a letter of agreement or letter of authorization from the FAA and be potentially certified under Part 136 to do that. Okay, you can do certain types of aerial work, like crop dusting. You have to be certified under Part 137. Banner towing, you have to have a letter of authorization from the FAA to do that. Firefighting, you're operating in a restricted area, you have to be cleared to do that, and you have to pass training to do that. Okay, you could fly sightseeing flights in hot air balloons, but we're talking about airplanes here, not balloons. You can do a whole bunch of helicopter stuff. You can do external load operations in helicopters. Again, two asterisks. One, if you're flying a helicopter, and two, if you're approved to do so under Part 133. You can do emergency mail service, and there's a whole bunch of stipulations. You'd have to look up at Title 14 of the United States Code to see what it would take for that to happen. You can actually fly around candidates in elections, but there's a whole bunch of rules you have to follow in 91.321 for that one. And then you can fly a small unmanned aerial systems aircraft if you have a Part 107 certificate to do so. All right, so these are all things that you can do as a commercial pilot that still require more work. All right, you either need to become a CFI, you need to get an LOA, you need to be approved under Part 137, you need to have a hot air balloon, you need to be in a helicopter, you need to follow these stipulations, or you can follow these stipulations, or you have to have additional 107 certificate. All right. So you still haven't told me what I can do the day after I get my commercial check ride. That's what these items are. These are the other 3 of the 11 items that were not included on the previous page there. So really, all you can do right now as a commercial pilot without any additional training certificates, letters of authorization, operating certificates, other stuff, other red tape. Really, all you can do right now is a ferry flight or a training flight. So a ferry flight, somebody says, hey, I just bought an SR-22. It's in Minnesota. I live in San Diego. Can you go get it for me? Yeah, charge them whatever you want. You can make them pay for your commercial ticket to go to Minnesota. You can pick up the airplane. You can charge them whatever you want to fly it back to San Diego for them. You can absolutely do that as a commercial pilot. Assuming, of course, you have a second-class medical certificate and a commercial certificate, which I'm going to have to assume you do. You can do some other aerial work. Remember, you can't do crop dusting and banner towing and things like that because they require letters and certificates and approvals and training. What you can do, though, is other aerial stuff like photography, survey work, power line, pipeline patrol, bird chasing. You can do aerial mapping. You can do all that kind of stuff because none of that requires any extra work. I'll be honest, you're probably going to hire into a company that's already certified to do that kind of stuff, which means, all the other companies too, crop dusting and all that. Um, we'll get into that here at the bottom. And the other thing you can do as a brand new commercial pilot is you can fly for intentional parachute operations. There's a couple stipulations, mainly that you have to do nonstop flights up to 25 miles for intentional parachute operations. So in other words, you can, the day after your commercial check ride, you can go down to Brown Airport and get a job flying parachute jumpers. And it'll be you take off from Brown, you climb up to however high you can get that thing and kick people out and land back at Brown and do that all day long and build your hours and get paid to do it. Um, what you cannot do is take off from Brown with a load full of skydivers, fly all the way up to Paris, California, which is an hour or two flight away, and then drop off jumpers there, because that's not a nonstop flight within 25 miles. You went more than 25 miles. What you could do, however, is you could ferry the flight empty. If it's just you and the aircraft, you could ferry it from Brown Airport up to Paris Valley Airport, land up there, and then pick up parachute jumpers. And then as long as you drop them off within 25 miles, you're okay. What you cannot do is load up parachute jumpers, take off, kick them out, and then fly 50 miles away and land, because that was not a nonstop flight. All right, so really what you would do, let's say I've got a big airplane and I want to kick people out of it for a living, but I want to live in San Diego, but my job is in Paris Valley. What you could do under this regulation then is you could ferry the aircraft from San Diego to Paris, land, your ferry flight's over, pick up jumpers all day, pick up jumpers, kick them out, land at Paris Valley, pick up jumpers, kick them out, land at Paris Valley again. On the last flight of the day, you kick out your jumpers. You have to make sure you land at Paris Valley first before you then ferry the aircraft back to San Diego. If you do that, you're covered. Okay. And all the other stuff, though, on the previous page, you can be hired by a company that already has the approvals to do that. So let me go back here really quick, all right? So if you have a CFI, that's still kind of on you, but you can get hired straight into a company that already has the LOA and do tours. You get hired into a company who's already authorized to do banner towing. You can start towing banners. You can do all this other stuff, basically, if you get hired by somebody who's already done all this work to get approved. So yes, you can do a lot of this stuff, just not on your own. You probably have to hire into somebody else who's doing it already. Okay, let's get out of that stuff for a little while. Let's talk about some other stuff you should probably already know. Okay, you need a medical certificate before you can go and fly as PIC in any of these aircraft. Okay, as a private pilot, you can recertify under Basic Med, but as a commercial pilot, you cannot. Okay, so as a commercial pilot, you need to have at least a second-class medical certificate. Basic Med does not cover you when you're flying commercial pilot privileges. Okay, so let's start with the top. Let's start with a first-class medical certificate. That's the highest class that you can get. If you're less than 40, then basically the way we say it is it's valid for the operations requiring an ATP certificate. So you only need a first class if you want to be an ATP, only if you want to exercise your ATP privileges. And if you're under 40, then it's valid as a first class for ATP privileges for 12 months. After that, it jumps straight to being good as a private pilot. So it's still a first class medical, but it's only valid as a first class medical for 12 months. And then your first class medical is only valid for private pilot privileges for 4 years after that. So this is the case. Your first class medical is good for the privileges of an ATP and a commercial pilot both for 12 months. And then it's good for the privileges of a private pilot for up to 60 months after the day you got it. Now, if you're over 40, it becomes a little more complex because they want to see you every 6 months for ATP. So let's say you get a first class medical. It's valid for ATP privileges for 6 months. And then after that, it's valid for commercial privileges for 6 more months. So let's kind of skip over this. What if you only care about commercial stuff? Then if you only want to exercise the privileges of a commercial pilot, not an airline transport pilot, and you only need that if you're going to fly in the front of commercial airlines, okay, not a commercial pilot. Then if you got a first class, then it's still good for commercial privileges for 12 months, and then only difference is the private pilot, it's only 2 years then. So for the privileges of a commercial pilot, you get a first class medical. It's good for a commercial certificate for 12 months, and then it's is good for a private pilot for 12 months after that. But if you're only going to be a commercial pilot and not an ATP pilot, why are you wasting your money paying extra money for a first class medical? All you need is a second class medical. So if you're going to get a second class medical, every year you got to redo a second class medical to keep being a commercial pilot. It's not easy. Every year you got to go see an AME, and then you're going to get a new commercial certificate, a second class medical certificate. Now, what if you're like, well, being a commercial pilot's not for me. I'm just going to fly for fun for a while. Then it's still good for 4 more years if you're under 40, or 12, 1 more year if you're over 40. Also, that's the day you get it. If you get your medical certificate the day before your 40th birthday, it's still good for 5 years as a private pilot. But if you wait till your 40th birthday to get your medical certificate, it's only good for 2 years as a private pilot. And then third class medical is good for check rides, actually. So if you have a third class medical, or if you have a 4-year-old first or second class medical, you can still do all your check rides. You can take your ATP check ride, your commercial check ride. You just need medical to take a check ride. But before you fly commercially, before you operate the privileges of your commercial certificate, you will need at least a second or a first class medical certificate. Okay. As we continue down part 61 here, we're still talking about some of the stuff in there. So before you can act as PIC of a complex aircraft, okay, so again, not log PIC, because you're doing that while you get the training here we're talking about. Before you can act as the PIC of a complex aircraft, which means we don't even define it in the regulations. Well, that's silly. Let's go back down the rabbit hole then. Okay, part 61.1 defines a complex airplane. That is an airplane that has retractable landing gear, flaps, and a controllable pitch propeller. There's a few other stipulations there. Those are just the most common complex aircraft. And they also define things like instrument training and cross-country time. That's a pretty big deal here. You need a lot of cross-country time. Remember, you need 50 hours of cross-country PIC time to become a commercial pilot in airplanes, and this defines how you get that. It's from one place to another, and you use some form of navigation. Literally, that's what cross-country is. However, then they get into the weeds. So basically, if you take off from airport A and land at airport B, which is 1 mile away, that was technically a cross-country flight because you landed somewhere else from where you took off from. However, down here in cross country 61.1, whatever this is, II, for the purposes of meeting the aeronautical experience requirements. This is where they get into if it's for any airplane certificate or rating, it has to be more than 50 nautical miles from point A to point B. If it's for a helicopter, it only needs to be 25 miles from point A to point B. If it's for a private instrument commercial, you need to have a landing at point B to count it. If it's for cross-country purposes for an ATP, you don't have to land, but you still have to go more than 50. So there's all kinds of stuff on here. Talk to your flight instructor about that. They should definitely understand that. Okay, they also talk about training time. This is what you log as dual received or ground training received, which does include flight simulators and flight training devices. Again, you'd have to talk to your specific instructor about that. All right, back out of the rabbit hole. Let's get back here to commercial. Complex, I mean. So before you can act as PIC of a complex aircraft, you have to receive and log ground training and then get an endorsement. Okay, you don't have to take another check ride again. It's you receive ground training from an instructor, and an authorized instructor is a CFI who has a complex. There's not much more to it than that. Which up until a few years ago it was every CFI, but now you might actually have a CFI who's never flown a complex airplane before, so you kind of got to ask. And it's a one-time endorsement. You learn here in this VTail Bonanza, you get your complex and high performance endorsement in this aircraft. You can fly any other complex or high endorsement aircraft out there, or high performance aircraft without any additional training on them. Okay, back to exact same verbiage, but for high performance aircraft. And high performance aircraft is an airplane with an engine of more than 200 horsepower. So if you're flying an airplane that has four engines that are all 200 horsepower each, it's still not a high performance aircraft because none of the engines have more than 200. Okay, so any engine on the aircraft has to be 201 or greater horsepower for it to be considered high performance. Anyway, same thing. Receive and log ground training and flight training and get an endorsement. No new check ride and stuff like that. Same with pressurized aircraft capable of operating at high altitudes. And I put this in here because it's a little confusing. Not every pressurized aircraft requires a high altitude endorsement. The aircraft has to be capable of flying above 25,000 feet for it to be a high altitude aircraft that requires this endorsement. So, like a lot of pressurized 210s, for instance, they only go up to 24,000 as the max operating altitude. You can fly those without this high altitude endorsement, but before you fly an aircraft that needs to go, that is capable of flying higher than 25,000 feet, that is also pressurized, you have to have this endorsement. Same thing though, a ground training, flight training endorsement. The tricky part is it has to be ground training. That's easy. But flight training in that aircraft, in the high altitude capable 25,000 feet aircraft, it has to be done on one of those. And people are pretty reluctant to give you that kind of aircraft to do that in. Okay, and then to fly a tailwheel aircraft, same stuff. I actually copy and pasted it because it's the exact same stuff. It's ground training, flight training, logbook endorsement for a tailwheel aircraft. Once again, during your tailwheel training to get your endorsement, you're still logging PIC time because you're still a private pilot building that new experience for that new endorsement. You just can act as PIC until you have that endorsement. Okay, some other Part 61 regulations that are pretty important. You probably should know. 6139 says what you have to jump through before your practical test, your check ride. 6151 tells you how to log stuff in your logbook. 6156, for instance, tells you how to stay current as a pilot. That talks about your 2-year flight review you have to do. Things like 6157, your 3 landings within 90 days to be current to carry passengers. And it's not 3 landings in 3 months, okay? It's 3 landings in 90 days. So you actually have to count backwards by the day. And then it talks about what you have to do to carry passengers at night, each category, class, and type of aircraft, that kind of stuff. 6160, there's one that tells you have 30 days to change your address if you move, and so forth. There's a whole lot more. Just be ready to go look them up on your own if you ever need to. So let's finally move on a little bit to how you lose your license. Part 91 regulations that you really should know. You should already know these coming into this course, and you can go look them up on your own and learn more about them. And a lot of these regulations specifically will be covered in your test prep book when they ask you questions about these regulations. Some of the bigger ones, okay, 91.3 is the responsibility and authority of the PIC. That's everything's on you, right? You as the PIC get to say yay or nay. 91.13 is a catch-all regulation. If they catch you you weren't really violating another regulation, but you weren't being smart about it, they can get you with a careless or reckless operation. A lot of times, if you do violate a regulation, specifically minimum safe altitudes happens a lot. This is a regulation that says you have to be, unless you're taking off for landing, you have to be high enough to where if a power unit fails, you can make an emergency landing without undue hazards to person or property on the surface. I'm not actually reading this. That was from memory because we've gone over this so many times already. And then it says you have to be in a congested area. You have to be 1,000 feet above the nearest obstacle within 2,000 feet. Over uncongested areas, you have to be 500 feet above the surface, and over sparsely populated areas or open water, you have to maintain 500 feet from a structure, a person, or a vessel. Let's say if you get caught buzzing people because you were less than 500 feet from people and you can't justify it by taking off or landing, they're going to get you with violating 91.119 and violating 91.13 because you were careless and reckless while you were violating this regulation too. If you do that with low fuel, you violated 91.151. There's separate regulations for IFR fuel requirements. For instance, 91.169 is the one that says when you have to have an alternate airport on your IFR flight plan. So there's regulations for all that stuff as well. And 91.213 says what to do if something's not working. That's if you go out and your proverbial landing light's not working for your day flight. What do you do? Um, which is shame on you. Why'd you check it? But besides that, 91.213 talks you through, do the FARs require it for that type of operation? Is it required on the type certificate? Is there an airworthiness directive that requires it? Can you safety complete the flight without that? Then you need to deactivate it and placard it, or remove it and placard it. All those steps you would have to follow for equipment that's not working before you can go fly on it. And then more. Obviously, Part 91 is pretty extensive. There's a lot of numbers in Part 91. Why do you need to know all this stuff? Well, bad things happen if you don't. Okay, I mean, yeah, you could die. There's that, and you could lose your job, which is probably more likely. You can get in trouble. So the legal enforcement actions the FAA will do, and if you just search for FAA legal enforcement, you're probably going to go to a page that explains all this. They can do what they call a certificate action. They could suspend your certificate. They could deny a future certificate. They can revoke the one that you already have and make you start over again, and then deny you when you try to apply for it again. And there's actually civil actions too. They can fine you up to $400,000 if you're a business, or up to $50,000 if you're an individual or a small business. So if you violate these regulations, they can fine you up to $50,000 for doing it. Like per instance too. So they find out you've been flying illegal charters for the last 2 years, and they're going to fine you $50,000 for each instance they can prove for the last 2 years. So it catches up quick. So don't go breaking these rules and these regs. Most of these you should probably know from your prior training, but they're important enough that we're going to bring them up again. So these acronyms we have that help tie in a whole bunch of different regulations. So you see here, this is 4 different regulations, 4 different regulations in one acronym. So these are the documents that you have to have on board for the aircraft, and a little bit for you and for the aircraft. Your airworthiness certificate. It's valid as long as the aircraft is maintained in an airworthy condition, so we'll have to check our inspections next. The registration expires after 3 years, and it wasn't always the case. They used to be good forever, so you kind of got to check that periodically. Your radio station license. It's only if you're going to operate an international flight. Operating limitations, which is either on the dash, in the POH, or any combination thereof. The weight and balance data, okay, not actually your weight and balance calculation for that flight, but the one that's in the aircraft when it was built and weighed and measured. And then usually in that weight and balance section will be an equipment list. And that equipment list will usually, if not all aircraft have it, and I know that's not how you spell aero anyway, but if an aircraft has the equipment list in it, it will list equipment that has to be working for that flight. So if you have it, you need to use it. Okay, 91.103 is a pretty important one. This is the one that says each pilot in command shall has a regulatory requirement saying you have to do it. You don't have a choice. Before beginning a flight, become familiar with all available information concerning that flight. So yes, you need to be omnipotent prior to starting the aircraft. To do that, a good checklist to use is the NW Craft. You need to look up NOTAMs, and if you call a weather briefer, you'll get that from them. You need to look up weather, and if you call a weather briefer, you will get that as well. You need to look up known ATC delays, and you guessed it, call a weather briefer and they will tell you if there's any known ATC delays for your flight. However, you don't just call a weather briefer, hang up, and go fly. There's still stuff you have to do. You have to determine the runway lengths at your airports of arrival and departure. You have to decide on an alternate course of action if the flight cannot be completed as planned. Okay, not an alternate airport. Alternate airports are not required for a VFR flight. That's an IFR requirement. So on my quizzes, if you put alternate airport, I know you copied and pasted from somewhere else that had it just a little bit wrong, and you will get it wrong. Okay, so it's alternate course of action if the flight cannot be completed as planned. Fuel requirements. We just looked at 91.151 for VFR fuel requirements or IFR requirements. This is you need to make sure that you will have enough fuel to get from point A to point B and still have your legal 151 reserve. So if you run out of gas point A to point B, they're going to get you with a 91.103 because you didn't pre-flight well enough, 91.151 because you didn't have the fuel, and a 91.13 because you were careless and reckless in your pre-flight planning and not having enough fuel. So you just violated 3 regulations. And then you have to determine takeoff and landing performance. And this says specifically if there's a POH that gives you this information, you have to know it. So you have to use your POH and figure out how much runway you need and compare that to how much runway you have. Okay, this is everybody's favorite acronym here, 8 tomato flames. If you're flying helicopters, you might have had something like Camel's Foot, or I've seen some other ones too. This is just basically the most common one. This is everything you need to operate in day VFR. So 91205 requires every one of these things to be working for day VFR flight. If any of these is not working, you probably legally cannot do that flight. The only exception, the only way you could, is if you get a permit. If the FAA authorizes that flight, which allows you to fly an otherwise unairworthy aircraft under those set conditions, basically it's only going to be ever to get it repaired. Okay, so all these items you need in the aircraft. Okay, so I'm going to run through it briefly. You have to have an airspeed indicator, and it has to work. If it's an unreliable airspeed indicator, it doesn't work. You cannot fly it. Same with TAC for each engine. I know you can hear it or you can guess what the RPM is, but it has to be working according to this regulation. Oil pressure gauge for each engine, if it has an oil pressure system. If it doesn't have a pump, it won't have a gauge. You don't have to have it there. Every flight has to have a compass, and this is installed in the aircraft, not in your pocket. I don't have a little land navigation compass. I can't use that if the one on the aircraft is broken. Okay. Altimeter. And you need to have a temperature gauge if you have a liquid-cooled engine. You probably have an air-cooled engine on your training aircraft, so you won't see this. However, you will see an oil temperature gauge. As opposed to a coolant temp gauge, you'll see an oil temp gauge for each air-cooled engine. Fuel gauge for each tank. It doesn't have to have a separate gauge for each tank, but you have to have a way of checking the quantity of fuel in each individual tank. If you have retractable landing gear, you need a landing gear position indicator. That's only if you do. You have to have an anti-collision light even during the day. The asterisk here is if it's a 1996 or newer aircraft, it's required to have an anti-collision light during the day. If it's older than 96, it did not require an anti-collision light during the day. That's your beacon or your strobe lights. So it depends on how old the aircraft is, if it requires an anti-collision light during the day or not. You have to have a manifold pressure gauge for each altitude engine. What they mean by that is if you have a controllable pitch propeller, then you need to have a manifold pressure gauge. Your 172 fixed propeller doesn't have a MAP gauge because it doesn't have that. You have to have an ELT unless 91217 I think says that there might be 207. Anyway, unless the other regulation says that you can do it without, but most operations will require an ELT. And you actually have to have a seatbelt, and it actually specifies the metal-to-metal latch. So you can't just baling twine somebody into the aircraft and call it good. It has to have a built-in metal-to-metal latch on the seatbelt. Okay, so that's stuff for day flight. What about for night flight? For night flight, we use I-flaps, and if you look up 91205, you will scroll down a little bit and you see the requirements for night VFR flight. And many of you already know this is my pet peeves here. When you Google acronyms, there's a lot of wrong ones out there. So these are this way for a reason. The I in I-flap stands for the instruments and equipment required for day VFR. That was your 91205 8 tomato flame stuff. It does not, I repeat, not stand for instrument lighting, which is not a requirement under Part 91.205. Some aircraft might, like a Robinson helicopters, require the instrument lights to be working. That's a Robinson requirement, not a 91.205 requirement. You have to have a spare set of fuses if the aircraft has fuses, or if it doesn't have fuses, you have circuit breakers, then you're good. You don't need fuses. You have to have a landing light, but that's only if being operated for hire. That's if the aircraft itself is being operated for hire. This is kind of weird. So let's say if I'm at a flight school and we are renting a student the aircraft, they are paying for the aircraft, they're renting it. Then whether I'm with them or not, if it's a instruction flight or they're renting the aircraft, that aircraft is being operated for hire. It needs a landing light. Now, what if I'm in a flying club and the student, or what if the student flies their own aircraft, which is kind of how a flying club regulatorily works? They're a member of the club. But let's say a student you have your own airplane. You can fly at night without a landing light because you're not being paid for that flight. The aircraft's not for hire. It's your airplane. You're flying it. You could legally fly without a landing light. Um, if you're stupid enough, I mean, if you do something stupid enough, not if you are stupid enough, if you do something crazy enough or stupid enough, or in the eyes of somebody else was careless or reckless, they'll still get you with a 91.213. Um, you need an anti-collision light at night, no matter what, no matter how old the aircraft is. You need position lights at night from sunset to sunrise, no matter how old the aircraft is, and some source of electrical power to then power all those lights. Okay, no hamsters. Has to be a battery or a generator, an alternator, something like that. So if you're flying an old aircraft that doesn't have position lights, an anti-collision light, or doesn't have a built-in battery or anything like that, then you have to be landed at sunset, because sunset to sunrise, you have to have those lights. And if you don't have those lights, you can't fly after enter time. Right. All right, you need some other stuff for commercial flights in addition to the tomato flames and the eye flaps, and you might actually have more requirements on your operating certificate too. But commercial flights are operating beyond power-off gliding distance from the shore. So you can do tours up and down the coast, as long as if your engine quits, you can glide to the shore. You don't need to carry this stuff. But if you're going to go from San Diego to Catalina, you can't glide to the shore. You need to carry flotation devices for everybody and a pyrotechnic signaling device, like a flare gun or something like that. Now, this does not apply to Part 91 flights, so you can fly for fun as a private pilot and to and from Catalina all day without a flotation device for anybody on board. Legally, you don't need that, but soon as it's a commercial flight, soon as that is a commercial flight being paid for that operation, you need to have a flotation device for everybody and a flare gun. Also, you have to have an operational landing light after dark. So it goes back into our eye flaps. So the landing light's only required for night VFR if it's a commercial flight. Okay, another acronym. That's a pretty big one. This might be slightly different for whichever you learn on your private pilot as well too. Just because this one works better for my.
Our acronyms and everything else we need to know to wrap up a bunch of other regulations. Here we have Aviates. This is a little different from Aviate, which a lot of you probably learned before. I have it this way because 2As are for two different inspections, which are like the only two required inspections. But now that you're in commercial and the aircraft are probably being operated for hire, then let's just go ahead and add an extra letter in. So to talk through these, ADs, of course, are required no matter what. If the AD says it's due, it's due. The aircraft is not airworthy if it's not in compliance with an AD. VOR checks. You're probably flying IFR now that you're flying people in places, stuff, and every 30 days you have to check the VOR if it's being used for IFR. If it's not being used, you don't have to, but it's better to have and not need than need not have. 100-hour. Now that the aircraft is being operated for hire, more than likely, it's going to require a 100-hour inspection, and that's on tack time, not hops time. Think like mileage on a car versus how many hours you sit in a car. So the 2 meters you probably have in the airplane, the tack time is the one the 100-hour inspection comes off of. And the only way around that would be if you're on a maintenance program, like a progressive inspection program or something like that. But starting out, you're probably not. An annual is due every 12 months, as long as it's a civil aircraft, or again, unless there's some kind of a progressive inspection that goes along with that. The transponder inspection is due every 24 months, and you're probably going to need that because more Mode C ADS-B requirements require a current transponder. And again, if you're flying commercially, at least you're flying people and stuff places, you're going to fly in and out of busy areas that require that. Things like crop dusters probably don't have a transponder because they don't need one. Again, unless you do. The ELT is due there's actually 2 ELT inspections. There's a 12-month inspection where we have to test it and inspect it to where we actually simulate a G load to see if it sends out a signal automatically. The other one is the battery life, where we look at the sticker, no joke, on the battery, and we put in a logbook when that sticker says it needs replaced. The other thing is if it's been used for more than an hour, you're supposed to replace the battery. And then the static altimeter pitot system, most of you're going to say do it the wrong way and Google, and you're not going to get the S on Aviates, and you're going to get 100-hour or annual because you're going to put an altimeter instead. So use Aviates. One less reason to forget an inspection. Basically, if the aircraft is flying for IFR, you need to do this inspection every 24 months. It's the exact same equipment that gets hooked up when you do the transponder inspection. You just got to pay a little bit extra to get this one done too. So since everything's hooked up, you might as well do all of them. And again, you're probably going to need it in the commercial world anyway. All right, at least one more to go. Safety brief. Okay, to comply with 91.519, this says the PIC is responsible for ensuring all passengers have been briefed. It doesn't mean the captain of your Southwest flight comes back and teaches you how to use the seatbelt, right? But they're the ones that had to make sure you get the takeoff briefing before you take off. This is what I use with my passengers when I fly, even in smaller aircraft. Make sure the safety belts, they know how to use them, air vents, they don't get sick, fire extinguishers, they can put me out, emergency exits, and how to use them and get out of the aircraft. I talk about talking real quick. If you hear people talking on the radio or me talking on the radio, try to let us finish first, that kind of stuff. And then, of course, if you have any questions, it's a great time for them to. Sometimes they won't say anything because they don't want to interrupt, because they don't want to. You just got done telling them that you don't want them to interrupt you, and so that's a great time to say, "Do you have any questions?" Okay, we saved the best for last, right? Well, hopefully not. Hopefully you never have to use any of this stuff, because that means something went wrong. But NTSB 830, it's actually in Title 49. It's not in Title 14 like all the other ones we've been looking at today. Title 49, Code of Federal Regulations, Part 830 is the National Transportation Safety Board. So the NTSB, it's their job to investigate all aircraft accidents and rail, marine, and things like that. But it's their job to investigate accidents. So what they do is they compile this data, give it to the FAA, they make recommendations. The FAA then can make regulatory changes. The NTSB doesn't work for the FAA. That's their totally different title of the code. So they can say and do what they want, basically, without repercussions. NTSB 830, when you look it up, and just look for that, go to 49 ECFR 830, and you can look them up on your own. They give definitions for things like what defines an aircraft accident, or severe injury, or substantial damage. These are very important terms that you need to understand, so make sure you look them up. They're also covered in ASA test prep book as well too. So they give you definitions on that stuff. They tell you what you have to report. This is 830.5. We'll talk about that next. What you have to give them and how many days you have to give them. This tells you if you can move wreckage or not. Basically, you can move wreckage only to keep it from being damaged further. If they wreck on the beach, and you can leave it alone unless the tide's coming in, then pull the wreckage up away so it'll get washed out to sea, that kind of stuff. And then reports, what you have to give in the reports and how to make that report. So hopefully you never have to experience these, but this is one way of remembering kind of the most important items that you might have to immediately notify the NTSB. So if any one of these items happens, you are supposed to, after the flight, not in flight, first thing fly the airplane, after the flight, notify them that one of these things has happened. And they say by the most expeditious means available. In other words, call them. Don't send them a letter. Okay, so you go on NTSB and you just search for the phone number there. It's on the regulatory website. If you look up 49 CFR 830, you'll get their information there. So these are the things that you need to immediately notify. Okay, so property damage. If you damage something more than the aircraft, or other than the aircraft, more than $25,000, then you have to report this. Okay, so if you do $20,000 worth of damage to a car, you don't have to report that. If you do $30,000 damage worth to a car, you do. It doesn't matter if you did $50,000, $100,000 worth of damage to your airplane. This is something other than the aircraft. Now, if there's an aircraft accident, and of course 830.1 defines aircraft accident basically as there was a death or a serious injury, the aircraft received substantial damage. And you have to look at the sub-definitions for each one of those to see if it met the requirements of an accident for you to report it. If there's a flight control system malfunction or a failure, this includes flaps, trim, ailerons, hydraulics that can control the flight controls, any of that stuff. If an aircraft is overdue and believed to have been in an accident, if they took off for 3 hours of fuel and it's been 5 hours and you haven't heard from anybody, you should probably call. They're not still flying, that's for sure. If propeller release happens, besides ground contact, and you'll see this a couple times in these rules, if you're flying along and your propeller flies apart, the NTSB wants to know about it so they can do some investigation to find out, why propellers are failing on you. They don't care if the propeller hit the ground and then flew apart, because that's kind of what happens when propellers hit the ground. So that's a normal thing. If you hit the ground with a propeller, it's probably going to go to pieces. If you have a turbine engine failure, okay, not a piston engine, but a turbine engine fails, and only then if the parts of the turbine engine leave somewhere besides the tailpipe. So, in other words, if your turbine engine fails and all the guts shoot out the tailpipe, you still would not report that. However, if you have a turbine engine fail and it blows apart and stuff goes through the side of the engine cowling and into the cabin area and sucks out a passenger, that's when you would have to report it. If a crew member becomes incapacitated or ill enough to where they can't perform their duties, it doesn't mean that you have a headache or a tummy ache. Okay, it means you had a heart attack or you're so sick you can't keep flying or things like that. An in-flight collision, not an on-ground collision. Okay, so it's an in-flight collision, and if you have more than 50% of your electronic displays are lost. So let's say you have a G1000, you have an MFD and a PFD, and the MFD completely goes blank on you. Well, that was 50% of your screens. You would not report that. But if you have 3 screens and 2 of them go blank, then that you would, for instance. And then if you have an in-flight fire, again, in-flight, not on ground. Okay. So when do you have to report what? Well, you have 10 days to file a report after an accident, and that's only if they ask you to. Okay, so if there's an aircraft in an accident, immediately you notify them, and if they say, well, that sucks, could you get me a written report? You have 10 days to cross your I's and dot your T's before you send it off to them. And however, if an aircraft is overdue, you call them right away and say, hey, that aircraft is still, I think an aircraft has been in an accident. The NTSB says, well, that sucks. Could you give me a report? You got 7 days to do it. You got 7 days to do it. Again, to reiterate, you only file a report if they request you to. You have to notify them immediately if any of these items happen, and you only file a report if they ask you to. And just to really drive it home, you file that report to the NTSB. You do not file that report to the FAA. You don't immediately notify the FAA, and there's a pretty good chance they're going to find out because it's on the news that an airplane landed with the landing gear up at the airport, which, by the way, is normally not something you would have to report to the NTSB, much less land with a gear up at the airport and then call your local flight service district office and tattle on yourself. So make sure that if you do file these reports, you file it with the NTSB, not the FAA. And then there's a lot of scenarios that we could go through on this one. There's a lot of scenarios that are in your test prep book that basically say, you were taxiing an aircraft for the purpose of refueling it, and then somebody on board dies. Do you have to report that? Well, technically, no, because you never had the intention of flight. So it's not an aircraft accident because you never moved with the intention of flight. And then what if you take off with passengers, you land at your destination, and during the taxi for after your safe flight, you've landed, you're taxiing into the gate, and you plow into somebody's Aston Martin that was running across the taxiway when they shouldn't have been, and you caused $200,000 worth of damage to it. Would you have to report that? Yes, actually, because it was during the time the aircraft flew, and there was damage more than $25,000 to something other than the aircraft. The one of the important definitions of an aircraft accident is during the time that passengers have boarded the aircraft until time where all such passengers have disembarked after landing. So before the engines even start running, if a passenger gets on that aircraft with the intention of flight for your flight, that's when aircraft accident goes forward from there. If they have a severe injury, death, aircraft accident, then that would result in an aircraft accident. So of course you would look at 830.1 and get more definition on those definitions. All right, so what we talked about today then, we talked about a lot. We talked about a lot of rules and a lot of regulations and a lot of interpretations to them. So I really hope it helped more than it hurt. There's a lot to talk about. We didn't even talk about all of them. We just talked about some of the ones that needed talked about. Okay, so you don't need to go read the FAR-AIM because you'll probably never wake up if you do, but you need to kind of put these in practical applications as you keep hearing about stories or you keep coming up with these scenarios. You need to do a little bit of research on your own and figure it out. So we talked about the definitions and abbreviations, how to get your license, how to lose it, and then we started really going down the rabbit hole in 119 and definitions and what you can and cannot do as a commercial pilot. And really, again, in the end, you can do ferry flights, training flights, you can do parachutes, um, and there's not a whole lot of, you can do some aerial work like photos and pipeline, power line. There's not a whole lot else you can do unless you're lucky enough to get your commercial certificate and then get hired on with a company that has already done all the legwork for that. Okay, so it's the company that has the letter of authorization to do the tours. It's the company that has the letter of authorization to tow banners. So if you're lucky enough to get hired by them, all that's already done. One, short training regimen with you, and you're good to go, and you're starting to get paid to fly. So, any questions on regulations? First, I'd highly recommend you go to the regulations themselves. Look it up in the Title 14, the Code of Federal Regulations, or Title 49 for NTSB. Look up the regulation yourself and interpret it. The other next best thing you can probably do is going to be to go ahead and look up the FAA Chief Counsel interpretations. Okay, so these have won me so many arguments over the years. If you're not sure about, you're like, I heard something about a 2009 interpretation about logging PIC time, then you go straight to here. This is, again, with the FAA stamp on it. This is an FAA lawyer who researched this and put together this legal response to this pilot. And this one specifically, that's why I know, has won me plenty of arguments because of this one sentence right here. You get in arguments all the time where pilots were not logging PIC during their complex training when they should have been. So step one would be look up the regulations yourself and interpret them yourself. Step two is go to the FAA Chief Counsel and see if there was a previous interpretation on that. If not, by all means, write them and ask for an interpretation. Hesitantly, honestly, I would say you can go to the internet or to your local flight school and start asking questions. Problem is, you ask 3 different flight instructors the same question, you're going to get 4 different answers. So too many times the answer is, well, my flight instructor told me this. And if you ask them where their flight instructor heard it, they're like, I don't know, probably from a friend who heard it from a friend who heard it from a friend. These regulations actually do change over time, and you need to stay on top of that, or you need to do the research yourself. What I'm begging you to do is not just, honestly, don't even take my word for it. I try to back everything up I talk about and do with the regulations themselves. So a lot of the wordy slides in this video were cut and paste from the regulations, and then I just gave you my interpretation or my clarification on them. So, all right. I guess that's probably, oh yeah. So again, hesitantly at the end, would you want to go and actually go to like an internet search on that? So an internet search, if it goes to like a reputable website, you can probably trust what it says. However, I will say, if it goes to a forum, maybe half the people there are saying the right thing and the other half are saying what they heard, which may or may not be the right thing. So I like to go to where go to the room where it happens. Go as close as you can to that. Go where the regulations are written and interpreted there. So this would be a good argument saver right there. Again, the other one is the Electronic Code of Federal Regulations. And it's all of them here, but Title 14 is the one we're really talking about in this video here. Certification, regulations, and certification of air carriers. And then we get all the way down to, you'd have to search for Title 49 back here on Browse and search to get to Title 49 for NTSB 30. All right, that's probably it. So I want to say thanks for watching. I hope this helped. Jump on those resources you have available to you. Those will help you through the quiz, and that'll help you all throughout your training, and definitely in this course. So check down on the notes for a couple useful links that you might use, like the Office of the Chief Counsel, and enjoy. Thanks for watching.